So, ladies and gentlemen, this is then the class on globalization, integration, and international organizations. So that's a very important topic. And I will switch to the slides in a second. So there is a link, of course, between integration and globalization on the one hand, and also between globalization and integration. And then we have to take into account what is the role of international organizations. So we now can see the basically the starting slide. So globalization, integration, and international organizations. It's about facts, theory, opportunities, risks, and economic policy options. So now there are a lot of recommended readings, and I would argue that it is quite useful to take a look at OECD and IMF reports, EU publications. There is the IMF World Economic Outlook, and also the journal International Economics and Economic Policy, which I can recommend with various publications related here to our topic. Okay, so we have a disclaimer here at the beginning, and I very much urge you to read this. It's definitely important that copyrights are respected, and I think that should not be difficult. No Q&A session is recorded, so there's no reason to worry here. And the slides here to some extent build also on EIW research projects. Okay, so here what we see is a picture of the world economy at night. This is from NASA. And we have, I should say, some asymmetry, obviously, in the spatial distribution of output. And you can see we have these bright spots in Japan, in parts of China, in India, part of the Arab Peninsula, in Europe, in the US, and then just a few areas in Latin America and also in Africa. So we should shed some light in our whole module why that is with this asymmetry, and I think that regional integration and globalization plays a role here. For instance, in Africa, we do not see much regional integration so far, although more recently many African countries have launched a fresh start. In Latin America, we have, of course, certain big and important urban and regional centers, but there are also large parts where we do not see much economic activity. To some extent, we might say fortunately, because the Amazonas probably is good to have not full of economic activities, because then we would have less of this important virgin jungle, which is so important for the climate and CO2 absorption. So the question is, how can we organize integration and globalization as a stable and welfare-enhancing process? And to some extent here, the international organizations come into play. They were not important before 1860, 1870, and then after 1944 that all has changed. So we have some required reading. I very much recommend a proceedings volume from a conference which I had organized with Richard Tilley, and the book, which has a lot of famous authors on board. The title is Economic Globalization, International Organizations and Crisis Management. And there is certainly a very good and interesting contribution by Foreman Pack. There's a chapter by Flandreau, Fratiani, and Pattison, Harold James, by Gillingham on the ILO, by Good on game theory, Oliveira Martins on the environment, and then Bear, and also Tilly, BIS, and so on. I can recommend very much that you take a look at the journal International Organization. There are a lot of interesting contributions. For our field, it's also important to have some classical contributions in mind. So Buchanan and Tulloch, a book, The Calculus of Consent, or Manker Olson, The Logic of Collective Action. The books explain basically what is the motivation for cooperation, why is it rather easy in the case of Olson's book to organize certain activities, let's say producers' activities and interests, while it is rather difficult to organize the interests of millions of consumers now, to some extent because there are millions of consumers literally, and also their interests could be much more heterogeneous than in the case of producers. There are publications on the benefits of globalization or the dynamics of globalization, and Weiss, Sachs, and Weinhold in a report for the Bertelsmann Foundation. They show who benefits most from globalization. And then there is a book which partially deals with, how should we say, deglobalization, or you might say, with a new US preference in favor of bilateralism instead of traditional multilateralism, which most US presidents after 1945 clearly have supported. Now, since 2017, Donald Trump is president of the US, and this has brought many changes. And the title of the book is The Global Trump: Structural US Populism and Economic Conflicts with Europe and Asia, published by Belgrave in London. And actually, this book deals to a large extent with international economic relations and tries to identify what are the key new policy elements of the Trump administration. And one cannot rule out actually that US populism is not just a transitory phenomenon, and then Trump is just kind of a short-lived challenge, but Trumpism or structural populism can be a more long-term challenge. And the world economy will be rather difficult to organize as a place for stability, prosperity, free trade, if the US doesn't contribute to international leadership as it has done in the past 6 years or so. Yeah, here is the cover of the book, or actually also the back cover, and you can follow my talk of February 26 given at UC Berkeley, and that's available here on YouTube, and you can then switch to this. It takes about 43 minutes, I think, and yeah, hopefully it's really interesting. Okay, what are the basic ideas here? We have regional integration, for instance, the European Union and the creation of the EU as a customs union. At first, of course, it's just regional integration, and then we have some related activities in other parts of the world, also regional integration, let's say ASEAN, 10 countries in Asia. Okay, initially starting as a kind of a common military security club, we might say. But these days it's much more of a free trade area. There is in Latin America, Mercosur. So 6, or if Venezuela is included, 7 countries which have been eager to create a kind of a Latin American European Union. So also with free trade and with a common external import tariffs. And then we have in Africa ECOWAS, which also is one of the regional integration clubs. And to the extent that regional integration on average brings down international import tariffs, and to the extent that the positive real income effect in the respective region contributes then to more global imports, so to more imports from outsider countries, then we have a link between regional integration and globalization. So regional integration can be a building block for globalization, and I think one should not so much consider it to be a stumbling block, let's say, for free trade. Although one cannot easily dismiss maybe the idea that maybe a group of small countries, which then together are a big economy, so to speak, they might be more in favor of higher import tariffs, and they have some market power than, joint market power in the world economy. But there is this important argument of Jagdish Bhagwati, who has argued that basically in the modern world economy, where we have so much trade in intermediate product, it's more than 50% of world trade since about 2000 or so. And we can say that, of course, there is a strong interest of multinational companies to maintain global free trade, or let's say to maintain rather low import tariffs. So this was the argument of Jagdish Bhagwati. Yeah, economic globalization, on the other hand, with rising roles of big banks, multinational companies, internet firms, that might stimulate regional integration, in the sense that if smaller countries are facing these big, powerful companies, well, that's an uneasy situation if a small economy is just alone by itself. But okay, if many countries together create a regional integration scheme, then even small countries, of course, can have some power strategy. So they could also point out the market is now bigger as you create a regional integration club. And as you have a bigger market, you can not just welcome just one foreign multinational company, but maybe 3 or 4 of them, which means you have more competition, which of course brings welfare benefits. There are often potential conflicts in trade, in foreign direct investment, portfolio capital flows, or in banking, or there's the problem of international recessions. And then it is useful to have an international organization, but we might also add it's only since about 1860 that the idea of international organizations became more popular, and then soon the first international organizations were created. At first, just a very few, and we will hear about some of these initiatives, but we can say that many new international organizations were actually created after World War II, or we might say after 1944, actually. The question then is, what are the costs and benefits of a multilateral system? A multilateral system is one in which international organizations play a role, and you would then try to balance the interests of not just two countries, which is bilateralism, but of many countries at the same time. And we can ask who gains power through international organization membership. What are the consequences? Now, there can, of course, be potential conflicts of interest between countries which have rather different per capita income and purchasing power parity measured. And we will use here a star to denote a foreign variable. And so some reasons for conflicts can be simply related to different per capita income, small y in country 1 and small y star in country 2 or abroad. Okay, if you have rather similar per capita income, you typically have also similar interests. So let's say in the protection of property rights, in stable financial markets, and so on. Yeah, there can be asymmetric shocks, which of course could mean an advantage for some countries and disadvantages for other countries. And there is this old distinction, of course, between big countries versus small countries. So big countries, I would say, have more options for their international policy because as they are big, they, for instance, can negotiate with each other. So let's say the US and China, or maybe the EU and China. The EU itself is, of course, not a country, but I mean, just for the sake of simplicity, we often argue as if the EU were one quasi country. Okay, if you have many small countries, the question is how many can you bring on board in an integration club? Obviously, it would not make sense to bring on board, let's say, 99 small countries. At least that is not easy to organize. And then there is always a certain risk, and that is the imperial overstretch of an international organization. So the international organization starts with a certain mandate and political support by the founding member countries, and then the IO gets bigger and bigger, so more countries come on board, and maybe also the area where the international organization is working is defined in a new way, and then the international division of labor among international organizations all of a sudden might no longer work in the old way, which was useful for all countries involved, and then international organizations also can get in a problematic situation, or it could be that the main financing country, the main member country, so in this case maybe the US, no longer would want to contribute to financing the international organization So there was, in the context of the Corona crisis, a problem in the sense that the US under President Trump said that the World Health Organization had not done a good job, was too China friendly, and therefore the US would hold back the annual contribution payments to the World Health Organization. Okay, we have various influences here coming from the red corner here on the right hand side. So there's the multinational companies' influence, and multinationals which could produce in country A, B, C, and so on. So they contribute to international systemic competition. Yeah, as MNCs often produce in many countries and therefore can easily compare political and economic systems, then they generate also pressure for reforms. That might indeed be useful because then we have a mechanism how successful or how useful institutional arrangements from one country is then diffusing to other countries. And there's generally the role of international mobility of capital and workers, which contributes to this international systemic competition. And it's, of course, very interesting to see now that in the past 25 years, a very large number of immigrants indeed went to the UK or Switzerland, France, not so much to Germany, but yeah, to these countries. And of course, if you attract a lot of immigrants, this is a signal that your institutional setting and the economic dynamics seem to be working well. Then again, of course, international migration can become a starting point for conflicts or specific problems. We have seen this in 2015 when we had a large immigration, actually a refugee wave from some Arab countries, Syria in particular, where you have a civil war, Afghanistan, where you have a civil war, and that caused conflicts in 2015 within the EU, where there were some countries which didn't want to accept any any refugees to come in, to immigrate. So one interesting question is coming back to the question of different interests of countries. Okay, are there economic mechanisms that bring about economic convergence? So that would mean that the per capita income of a relatively poor foreign country will catch up with country one, which has a per capita income small y. So here, of course, economic globalization could play a role. Certainly, international trade is part of this here. And I think also the mechanics of the neoclassical growth model, so capital accumulation, can play a role. And if we have foreign direct investment, well, then of course FDI inflows, foreign direct investment inflows, can contribute to faster capital accumulation, but also to international technology transfer and thereby to economic catching up. So then we have maybe indeed two or even three forces contributing to international economic conversion. So the first would be, of course, trade. The second would be foreign direct investment, and then also migration might play a specific role. Yeah, we will have more symmetrical preferences of countries I and J if we have economic convergence. So that will make negotiations much easier. Question is, how likely are asymmetric shocks? That's not so easy to assess. Okay, the coronavirus shock was a rather symmetric shock across countries in the world economy in 2020. And then finally, indeed, we have many, many small countries and very few big countries, and they might have indeed structurally different interests, and also the international policy options differ. Okay, economic globalization in the sense of creating larger and more intensive trade, investment, trade and investment networks, and also more migration. And of course, this new dimension of the digital globalization. So read simply the internet. Well, then globalization has been a process driven by, I would say, by political reductions of import tariffs, by politically designed liberalization of capital flows since the 1970s in the field of portfolio investment, since the 1980s, mid-1980s in the field of foreign direct investment. Okay, so integration is a regional phenomenon, and we often find that regional integration then reduces trade and investment barriers. It leads to regional institutions which are created, so the European Union, ASEAN, and so on. So international organizations then could be useful if we have temporary conflicts, and then conflicts have to be sorted out. So how many international organizations we have? We can say many, 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 69,000 in 2015. Okay, only a few of them are really well known. So the International Monetary Fund, the IMF at the global level, the World Trade Organization, UNEP, actually was the first UN environmental conference taking place in Stockholm. And UNEP was created in 1972. So that was indeed the date of the Stockholm conference. And then we have the International Telecommunications Union, which under a different name, related more to telegraphy and so on, already was established in the late 19th century. So we have the G20 and of course also the G7. So the G20 became quite active in November 2008. 2008 we had the transatlantic banking crisis, and it seemed not adequate to rely just on G7, but instead on G20 to help to sort out the very serious international problems from the banking crisis. So at a regional level, we have clubs like the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is located in Paris. we have almost 40 countries. Russia, on the other hand, is still not on board. We have special interest groups like the oil producers, which are active under the heading OPEC. When the OPEC was created initially in the 1960s, it was not very powerful, but it became much more powerful than after 1973. So there was the war between Israel and the Arab countries, and then the OPEC countries, a kind of a cartel of Arab oil producing countries. They pushed for higher oil and gas prices and thought this is this is interesting both economically and politically. And there is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was created just in 2015 and has its seat in Beijing. So this is a new situation that we have an international organization which has its seat in Beijing. Many international organizations, many big organizations are located in Washington, D.C. or in the US, let's say in this case in New York. And so besides Washington and New York and the US, we have a lot of international organizations in Switzerland, many important ones indeed then in Geneva. So I think it's an interesting development, and maybe also it's an important signal that the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is located not just in Asia, but indeed in Beijing. So all international organizations have a specific mandate, and usually it's all about international cooperation of countries. You have to organize somehow. And in an economic perspective, we are interested in allocation effects, stabilization, distribution effects here in the world economy. So look, we have here the leading countries in the first box on the left in the upper corner. Then we have regional integration just beside this box. Then there is a certain degree of economic globalization. And then we have the role of international organizations, which somehow should help to maintain an efficient and stable global or international economic system. That's not so easy, but okay, it's interesting to briefly look at the start of the International Monetary Fund. Was created in 1944 along with the World Bank. And what is the mandate of the IMF? Okay, they help countries, they help member countries to achieve convertibility of currency. So let's say in 1958, or maybe also 1945, there was an American exporter of tractors. He was trying to sell tractors to Germany and other countries in Western Europe. And okay, if you sell in Germany, at that time you get Deutsche Mark, but an American exporter is not interested in Deutsche Mark. The exporter wants to exchange the Deutsche Mark for US dollar, because at home you have to pay the workers, the loans, the dividends, the tax payments all in US dollar. So that means it's quite important that international monetary relations are such that there is convertibility of currency, so that a foreign exporter has the right to take the sales proceeds from selling tractors to the bank and then exchange this into US dollars. But okay, the question is, does the country have some US dollars? Are there sufficient foreign reserves available, and so on? And here the IMF can help countries to achieve this convertibility for trade. The IMF gives loans. Okay, if you want to take big loans as a country, you will face conditionality. So there are certain strings attached then to the loan, and particularly this will typically happen if a country has a current account deficit, a big current account deficit. The IMF can create international liquidity, so there are the so-called special drawing rights, SDR. This is fiat money which is created through a decision of the IMF board and its member countries respectively, and basically you can exchange your SDR into US dollar, but the amount of SDR is fairly limited. The IMF also does one important thing, namely they are responsible for monitoring of fiscal and monetary policy of EU member countries. So that's, I think, quite important. So there's an IMF mission which would really visit the treasury and also the central bank of the respective country, and then they write a so-called Article 4 report, and the government of the respective country can then add some text at the end of this report, so saying, okay, our view of fiscal and monetary policy is this and this. So that's interesting to read, I would say. And in addition to the so-called Article 4 reports, we have the so-called Financial Sector Assessment Program, FSAP, which we have since the Asian crisis, 1998. So this is a special report which is looking at banking and insurance. Obviously, the reports were not very, very good and very reliable in the run-up to the transatlantic banking crisis, because otherwise the FSAP reports would have told us there is a serious problem emerging. So the FSAP have started after the Asian crisis, and the idea, of course, was that financial market activities can generate instability in an economic system, and you want to avoid this, and therefore it's a good idea if the IMF writes a report and looks into the banking and insurance sectors. But for a long time, this was not mandatory. And for instance, President Bush Jr. At this time decided that there should be no FSAP on the United States, and the US, he was arguing, has such a great financial and banking system that it would be just squandering of IMF money if there would be a report on the US banking and insurance system. Now, too bad. 2008, we had then this banking crisis in the US. Okay, the IMF requires majority decisions. So 85% of votes are required, but the US has still veto power through its share of about 16%. So now the weight of the votes of individual countries depend somehow on the share in global GDP and in trade, but everything is negotiable. There is no simple formula where you simply plug in the figures and then you know what the weight of a country is. There's a big question of bilateralism versus adopt this here club policy, so multilateralism, we might say. Big countries always can pursue the national interest at the international level on their own, so countries as the US, China, Japan, or maybe the EU. Now, becoming a member country of an international organization, well, that maybe makes sense, but you will ask, what are the costs and benefits? And there are so-called interdependency costs, or the cost of consensus building. And there is, of course, the utility of membership, so maybe bigger global influence. And there's also then a question which regional or global integration club you should join, if at all, and then how many member countries, and so on and so on. So for some countries, the geographical situation is not so clear in terms of which club should I join. So Turkey, for instance, for a long time was interested and might still be interested to join the European Union, but Turkey might also decide to create its own regional integration club. Okay, if we talk then about utility and cost, so here is, in a nutshell, some rough calculation with some simple formulas, and then we can ask what is the optimum number of member countries. So let's assume that utility for a representative member I is simply a positive parameter small v times the number of member countries to the power 1/2, and then the cost function here, ci, is simply small c times n squared. Now, in reality, of course, different countries have different parameters, v and c. We disregard this here for the sake of simplicity. And then you as a country, you want to maximize the gain. So what is then the net gain from membership? And that's obviously indicated here in this formula 1. You then would have to take the first derivative of net utility with respect to the number of member countries. You set this equal to 0. And the second derivative then should be negative. And indeed, we have an optimum n, which is small v divided by 4 times the parameter c, this all in bracket, to the power 2/3. And just as an example, if v over 4c is 125, okay, then the optimum number of member countries would simply be 25. So that, you might think, sounds a little bit like the European Union. Okay, if that were the case, then we still have too many member countries. The UK, I would say, unfortunately, has left on January 1st. Maybe others also want to leave. We will see then. Okay, there is also a number of member countries here. It's called N1, where the net benefit from membership is 0. And certainly we can say that this N1 is larger than the optimum number N0. In a graphical representation, we can show how the solution is derived. So we have a cost function, and this is this upward bending c as a function of n curve. On the horizontal axis, you see the number of member countries, capital N. The utility function is bending downward, looks a little bit like a production function, which you all know. And okay, if you want then to maximize the benefit from membership, what you would want to have is that the distance between the two graphs becomes a maximum, which is the case if the tangency to both curves is parallel. So it's the solution n0. So as you can see, the distance e prime is maximal. And on the other hand, this critical membership number n1 is indicated by the intersection point F. And if the number of member countries increases beyond n1, then you will have countries who will want to leave the institution, the international organization. So this graph, in a nutshell, summarizes some of the key arguments from Buchanan and Tullock and the calculus of consent. And again, we can also point to Mankiw Olson and his book, The Logic of Collective Action, saying that homogeneous interests are easier to organize, and firms, of course, firms' interests easier than those of consumers. And on the other hand, there is indeed a role of qualified majority voting in the following sense, that you want to make sure that a critical number of countries all have to agree on a certain decision. Only then you have a majority, and the higher the qualified majority is, the easier it is for every country then to block a decision. So in the World Trade Organization, we have unanimous voting, which makes it sometimes difficult to get any decision. Although I think we all can be sure that, for instance, the United States or maybe also the EU, the big guys put a lot of pressure on smaller countries. So it is, on the other hand, let's say, an interesting challenge. Maybe think of the European Union to ask yourself, okay, which reforms could increase the utility of EU membership, so would rotate upwards the U curve. And maybe also you can raise the question, how can we reduce the cost of EU membership? So maybe we would rely more on digital voting. You will not always have these costly meetings in Brussels and so on. And okay, if you can do something like this, the number of member countries which could then join could maybe further increase. Okay, multilateralism is the idea to seek a balancing of national interests and to find a consensus via the interaction of many countries in parallel. So this is usually done in an international organization. It's certainly fairly important for small countries. And the director of the World Trade Organization said, this organization is needed to make the small big and the big civilized, so to make small countries more influential and to make sure that also the big guys would stick to some common rule book, the rule of international law, basically. Okay, the counter strategy is bilateralism, certainly favored by US President Trump. So he's in office since 2017. And this is potentially indeed attractive for big countries such as the US or China. So Trump is not supporting multilateralism, and this in turn is weakening international organization system. Here you have a graph which just shows that the growth rate of trade is larger than the growth rate of output. okay, this is also, on the other hand, of course, is then a negative element in the crisis. So in an economic crisis such as the international transatlantic banking crisis 2008-9, we see that that trade dramatically declines, and so if we have that type of problem, then we might think, okay, let's work together that the decline of output, the international recession, does not bring about a new wave of protectionism, so that very soon we will see then also again a steep increase in the growth rate of trade. And here you have a graph which is from Alexander Keck, John Hancock, and Coleman Nee, in an interesting paper. So if we have conflicts over trade, this quickly will translate into declining output or declining output growth, and we have all seen this in the 1930s because it all started as a stock market shock in New York in 1929, and then translated within a few years into a wave of protectionist policy interventions in the US and Europe. And then output growth both in the US and Europe strongly declined. It declined more than would have been necessary. So the world depression became very serious. Okay, roughly 90% of world trade is via shipping. So that means, of course, that international shipping is crucial and that the freedom of the seas is important. So you do not want to have pirates. You do not want to see military conflicts between countries which endanger the freedom of the seas. And certainly there is a certain role of the US as a global naval power. And the US, at least after 1945, had a similar role to what the UK had, let's say, in the 80 years before World War I, because it was the UK which always was emphasizing the freedom of the seas and would not accept if countries would impose kind of artificial barriers against free shipping. Okay, the economic perspective is okay. Trade output and growth of technology intensity. So this is all quite important and interesting. We have a parameter alpha, which actually is the share of foreign ownership in the capital stock, and there's a certain growth rate of knowledge. So knowledge is denoted as capital A. And there is a paper, Trade and FDI related, looking at the contribution to output growth here for EU countries. And in this Welfens paper in the Journal of International Economic Policy, so the journal International Economic Policy has this paper where you can basically read about some of the transatlantic perspectives. Also, what would be the benefits if we could have implemented the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement, which was a project under the Obama administration. It would have brought obviously more trade, but also more foreign direct investment. So we argue in our analysis that both trade and FDI contribute to output growth. A little bit here about the theory. Okay, we all are familiar with the macroeconomic production function, and we can write that Y, capital Y, so this is real GDP, is K to the power beta times AL in brackets to the power 1 minus beta beta double prime. And it is then assumed that imported intermediate products, so this is then small j, this is the share of intermediate products in total output, and if you multiply this with a parameter, with a positive parameter small j prime, then we get the impact on production. So 1 plus small j prime times small j to the power beta prime. And then we have also an effect from exports. This is the term 1 plus x prime, which is a positive parameter, times the export GDP ratio, and this to the power beta double prime. So this is related actually in the latter argument to Melitz, to a paper by Melitz. So we use here a knowledge function, which is a0 to the power times the Euler number to the power small at. T is the time index. And so we have an exogenous growth rate of knowledge, we could say. J is this output share of intermediate technology intensive products. And this means that if we import intermediate products from abroad, we effectively would raise the level of technology. And yeah, we have already heard about the Melitz argument. So Melitz basically was saying that if we open up an economy with heterogeneous firms, then the innovative firms will expand relatively fast, and this then could be interpreted in a way that that indirectly the ratio of exports to GDP will raise GDP. And the knowledge growth rate here is expressed as small a, which is equal to a autonomous domestic component, small a prime, and then we have a positive parameter, small a double prime times alpha times the foreign progress rate. So a star is small a star is the foreign progress rate. And yeah, this I think is an interesting perspective, and of course it suggests that foreign direct investment is important. So we can look here at the inward FDI stock as a percentage of the national capital stock, and you can see, okay, Ireland has a very high share here. It's almost 40%, or in some years even a bit more. And there's the Netherlands, the UK, the US, and other countries. If we have foreign direct investment, we must make a distinction between GDP and gross national product. Gross national product in real terms, this is denoted here as Z, and Z is equal to capital Y plus net factor income from abroad. Okay, if we just have multinational companies, then of course we are talking about profits from subsidiaries abroad. If, let's say, Germany or the Netherlands, we have invested abroad, then our subsidiaries abroad hopefully will be profitable, and then we will get some profits which are transferred back to the headquarter country. So now there is also a different perspective, namely to which extent the rise of profits in the headquarter country contributes to more FDI outflow. As one of the recent empirical papers has shown, there is some positive link also. Yeah, okay, bilateralism versus multilateralism, we already heard about that. I think there is some risk, yeah, that the U.S. President Trump's approach or his emphasis on bilateralism will bring the world economy back to the 19th century when we had these big power games. Of course, in the 21st century, some of the countries have different names because then the US and China suddenly is on board. Both are very influential countries. And maybe then also India or the EU and, of course, Japan. But it's not so clear that the European Union can survive as a stable big trading bloc or a big regional integration project. Yeah, multilateralism, we already have heard that. The Secretary General of the World Trade Organization summarized it all in one sentence to make the small big and the big civilized. And of course, if multilateralism is destroyed, then the small countries are the main losers. Whether big countries in the end would be winners, that is still an open question, because without multilateralism, you get so many more conflicts, and then also the big countries would have to invest a lot of resources to help either avoiding conflicts or to solving conflicts. At present, we still have a rules-based system using international organizations. This is what is the post-1944 global system. And among the important players is, of course, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, which actually before 1995 or 1996 was the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. Okay, now we have this corona pandemic, and this certainly is a new challenge also for international organizations. One important organization is certainly the World Health Organization. They get about 15% of their budget from the United States. On the other hand, the US, particularly under Trump, they are strongly criticizing the World Health Organization. They said they are too much on the side of China and have not warned early enough that, for instance, international air traveling should be stopped, air traveling with China, because the pandemic basically started in China. Okay, not all countries in the World Health Organization would support Trump's view, of course. Yeah, there's the role of the IMF. The IMF gives certainly loans for countries with current account deficits, and occasionally they might also be active in debt in foreign for countries which have a high foreign indebtedness. So the IMF can help countries which are in trouble, and okay, they will usually give conditional loans. So the loans have strings attached which say you should undertake certain reforms so that the situation should improve over time, and then you no longer will need special IMF support. There's a particular role of the World Bank. The World Bank has a AAA rating. Okay, if you have AAA rating, that means you can place a World Bank bond at a very, very low interest rate in international capital markets, and then you can use the proceeds to finance projects in poor countries. So you're helping poor countries via loans for development projects. So the World Bank pays much, much lower interest rates than, let's say, governments of developing countries. So this is therefore an advantage for developing countries to be a World Bank member country. Okay, if you are a country with a high per capita income, of course, you are not supposed to get World Bank money. Some countries with relatively low income manage often to continue in getting some support of the World Bank, but this is more of an exception, I would say. Yeah, there's the role of the World Trade Organization, and it's all about rules. It's about dispute settlement. Yeah, there's a so-called dispute settlement mechanism. The basic idea of the WTO and its predecessor, the GATT, is you want to avoid protectionism, and at the moment we just see some new protectionism, or we have already witnessed new protectionism in the corona crisis, and this was concerning the export of medical equipment. So France and Germany were reacting here to some extent strangely. Yeah, the World Trade Organization, I think, is very important. It has interesting principles. One principle you will hear about this later again is the most favored nation clause, which means that a trade concession which country A extends to country B has then to be given actually to all other countries as well, so to countries C, D until Z. So that's an interesting principle, and they have some other principles, national treatment and so on, which means that foreign investors should be treated in an equal way as domestic firms. Now, the international economic corona crisis, which is a medical and an economic crisis, is the first post-1945 international crisis without US leadership. So that, of course, is due to President Trump again, who doesn't want multilateralism, but to some extent maybe the US is also no longer in a position to easily come up with leadership. If you want to exert credible leadership position, then the idea, of course, is that you have broad political consensus at home, while the Trump administration, or Trump himself, has done really a lot to destroy the political consensus in the US, so to bring about more of a political polarization. And the Trump administration also has another problem. Trump was only able to replace 3/4 of the 4,000 political appointees of the Obama administration. And therefore there's a gap, there's a lack of staff of about 1,000 across all the ministries. You could look at a treasury, and more than 120 people also are kind of missing, which is no serious problem as long as you have sunshine in the world economy and there are no problems, there's no world recession and anything like this. But as soon as you have a major international recession, as we now have it with the corona crisis in 2020, then it's usually important to have some international cooperation. And here again, the IMF would play a certain role normally. But I think that IMF colleagues would have a hard time to identify within the Trump administration and Treasury whom should they call, because there is nobody. I mean, there is somebody, but not the typical experts they would normally hope to find. And the problem was that in early 2017, when the incoming President Trump was looking for intellectual supporters and new experts, then in the Trump administration, there were many of my American colleagues, also from conservative think tanks, who would simply say the career risk is too big to work for somebody like Mr. Trump. Okay, multilateralism is important. It's important certainly also from an EU perspective. The European Union itself is a multilateral organization. We had 28 countries. Now, after Brexit, we have only 27 countries because the UK has left the European Union on January 31st, 2020. And if we think about regional economic integration, yeah, we obviously have economic benefits. Otherwise, the EU, ASEAN, Mercosur, or the three-country group, Mexico, Canada, US, the so-called NAFTA, would not exist. Okay, Trump has reorganized NAFTA. He has negotiated a new deal with Canada and Mexico, and the name has changed a bit. But anyhow, yeah, so regional integration should bring economic benefits, and there are actually three elements. So there's trade creation. That means there will be more trade among the regional integration partners, because the integration partners would say, okay, let's just abolish the internal import tariffs and also quotas. So then you get more trade between the partner countries. On the other hand, you get less trade with outsider countries. This is called trade diversion. And in the economic integration area, you should get more innovation, according to the Melis argument, because the innovative firms will expand more than proportionately. So yeah, then if you are an integration club, all countries together have more, I could say, joint economic power at the global negotiation table. So here, take a look at the EU, and just to make clear, the EU is a customs union, so they have free trade within the EU, that's clear, and they have common external import tariffs. This is not the same as a free trade area, such as ASEAN, or previously in the EU there was EFTA, which was a rather big group in the 1960s of countries. They all had free trade among each other, and then every country has an individual import tariff, and yeah, that means every country is free to set import tariffs as it wants, while in the European Union, which is a customs union, or in the Mercosur, which is also a customs union, you will have to agree upon some common import tariffs and also some common trade policy. And in the EU, it is indeed the case that it's not the individual member countries which are negotiating a free trade agreement, let's say with Japan. There is a free trade agreement with Japan or with Korea and many other countries. But it's the European Commission which does this on the behalf of all EU member countries. Okay, then to some extent, obviously, Brexit is a counterexample, because I have argued that there are so many benefits from a customs union. Yeah, you will have free trade among each other. But on the other hand, Brexit is a special thing. Maybe it's more a political thing and not so much an economic thing. I understand that Brexit is a populist political project, and I have argued in my book, An Accidental Brexit, that the whole referendum was a kind of an unclear exercise, in the sense that the majority, was 51.9% in favor of Brexit, but the strange thing with the Cameron government was that they did not really give voters kind of a minimum of information on the economic consequences, and so the information standard was very, very low. It was low certainly also compared to the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, then the Cameron government had informed all the Scottish households in a leaflet that every Scotsman would lose £1,400 per capita and all the benefits of EU membership. Now, when the question of a British EU referendum came up, of course, one would have expected that the Cameron government again would write a brochure. They would probably make sure that there is a study which looks into the costs and benefits of EU membership and alternatively of Brexit. And there was such a study by the by Treasury, and this study from Downing Street 11 said basically, you will lose £1,800 per capita in a kind of a medium scenario. And on the other hand, if you take a look at the 16 pages information brochure on Brexit, there's not a single word that you will lose £1,800 per capita. And on the other hand, one can calculate based on a UK popularity function what would have been the result of the referendum if people had known this. So they would lose roughly 10% of income. And if you look then at a UK popularity function, which indicates the link between output growth and popularity of government, then the result would have been 52.1% in favor of Remain. So it's not so clear what the Brexit phenomenon really signals for the EU. I mean, I think one can be very critical both of the Cameron government, but also about the EU or maybe the German government or the French government, because they all did not really anticipate Brexit. They had no political risk management in place. And I think they relied and still rely on kind of weak methodology in terms of surveys of the EU popularity and so on. Okay, you can find all this in the book An Accidental Brexit, which is actually the #1 economic book on Brexit, was published in 2017 in London by Palgrave. Okay, the UN in New York, again, is a very big international organization. You have almost 200 member countries. Okay, you have a smaller group of very powerful member countries, which are then in the Security Council. And it is clear, on the other hand, okay, organizing 28 or 27 EU countries, or at the very beginning in 1957, 58, we had just 6 countries. Okay, that's maybe sometimes difficult, but that is manageable. With 200 countries, that's not so easy. It's very difficult to organize broad consensus because you have very many member countries. You have heterogeneous countries in terms of interest and real per capita income, respectively. Maybe it's easier to organize interest in the G7 or the G20. And G20 is roughly 2/3 of world GDP. It's actually a bit more than 80% of CO2 emissions. So if you can make progress here in G20, then this will have an enormous effect on the world economy, and in this case on CO2 mitigation. So it will be good for the climate. But okay, achieving some consensus in the small rich man's club G7. That's maybe easy, but again, G20 is much more difficult. So one question then is also in which fields the UN is really powerful. Hopefully in the field where the World Health Organization is active, so fighting epidemics and so on. Okay, a few words then on this coronavirus shock and the world recession 2020. So it's a fairly small number of countries, and then you have already 6% of the world economy in terms of GDP share. So you add the US, the EU, plus UK now, plus China and Japan. The biggest economy actually since 2017, maybe 2018 is actually China, if we measure income and purchasing power parity. And often the question, and just now the corona situation, the corona recession, there is the question, how these countries will react and will they cooperate? We have not seen big willingness to cooperate, let's say, between the US and China, but even in the EU, within the EU, there was also rather limited cooperation because so many governments were afraid that, let's say, free trade with medical equipment could mean that, let's say, Italy facing a very difficult medical situation in February would import a lot of medical equipment where maybe the French or German government thought they would need this for their own population. So with the corona shock this is really a big challenge for the US. I would say there's a rather weak US leadership, much to the contrary of the 6 decades before. Okay, in the EU, we see some neo-nationalism, I would say. We see that people like to close borders, at least for some time. In Italy, the political support for the EU has declined dramatically, so maybe there will be further disintegration. Okay, there's ASEAN, there's Mercosur and other regional integration schemes. And of course, the EU is an international organization. Okay, if it is a well-organized system, then maybe the EU comes up with a lot of good ideas and adequate policies to find the coronavirus and also to overcome the corona recession. If on the other hand the EU further disintegrates, then of course this would be a signal for other regional integration clubs that maybe their regional integration also doesn't make much sense, and then you will see a lot of economic and political instability in the world economy. Okay, the EU has several institutions which are important. Certainly important is the European Commission, which is the executive. We have a European Parliament, expenditure roughly 1% of GDP. That's not really big. A lot is for structural funds, for agriculture, for supporting poor regions in the EU. The European Court of Justice, that's often an important institution if we have conflicts, maybe of, let's say, the EU with EU member countries. So there are certain EU rules, and there's new EU legislation, and then some countries are not implementing this or implementing it in a strange way. And then the Commission could take member countries before the European Court of Justice. There's the EU Council. This is the organization of member countries. Here we have weighted voting in several fields, not in foreign policy, not in defense. And it's quite interesting to ask later. Okay, how is this with political power? Because countries have different weights in terms of voting. And then there is the European Central Bank and the ESRB. The ESRB is the European Systemic Risk Board. It was created in 2010. And it has as member countries EU countries plus Norway and Iceland, so member countries of the European Economic Area, and they are all active in the field of macroprudential supervision. So they are supposed to provide a broader risk analysis, not of an individual bank, but of the whole banking system, and then maybe the interaction of the banking system with maybe increasing oil prices, or with the corona shock and so on, and they can then provide political suggestions. The ESRB at some point has not worked very well, so I found it a bit strange what happened during, let's say, the Brexit years, 2016 to 2019, because the Bank of England was not very cooperative. If you want to have an adequate risk analysis, you should all sit together around the same table and then share information, while in reality the European Central Bank was doing the analysis together with many other institutions, which all are in the ESRB. So national member countries institutions, they were looking at the Eurozone. But as I said, it's an EU institution, and we have 19 countries in the Eurozone. Okay, then plus the EU, that brings us to 20, but we have 28 member countries, certainly until the end of 2019. So what is with the other 8 countries? And I really think that it's not a good spirit of cooperation if there is not full cooperation within such an important institution as the ESRB. And it's actually very important for EU countries on the continent, or for Ireland, because the largest part of the wholesale of the EU wholesale banking market is in London, was in London, is still in London, and so it's very important to share information with the Bank of England. Okay, so we have one common monetary policy for the Euro member countries, so 19 countries in 2020, but we have different national fiscal policies. So it's not so easy to achieve the right policy mix. Okay, the European Central Bank is politically independent, responsible for monetary policy and prudential supervision, at least when it comes to the big banks. And it has also this special role in the ESRB, in which the ECB is a leading actor. So there it is responsible, together with other institutions, for macroprudential supervision. Okay, the policy mix in a crisis is not so easy to get an adequate and consistent policy mix, because at least in the Eurozone, you have to coordinate 19 different member countries. There's no Euro finance minister or something like this. And then you probably would coordinate much of what should be done actually in the Eurozone. You would coordinate in the ECFIN, which is the Council of Ministers, here with the Ministers of Finance. And this brings us then to, let's say, the end of this presentation, and the next slide will then look at the relative size of GDP, in this case of the Eurozone, the EU 28, what is the size of the US GDP and the world economy. So there are some of these figures where we should know what is the order of magnitude. Yeah, thank you very much.